Imagine losing everything you've ever loved in the blink of an eye. Your dreams, your passion, even the person you thought would stand by you forever. That's exactly what happened to Ariana, a once famous ballerina whose life was shattered after a devastating accident. But just when she thought all hope was lost, a mysterious man entered her life with an offer that would change everything. A marriage built on a contract, a bond tested by betrayal, and a love neither of them expected. What happens when a deal meant to save one life ends up saving two hearts? Stay tuned, because this story will make you believe in the power of second chances and the kind of love that defies all odds. Ariana Moore had always been a dreamer. At just 25 years old, she had already achieved what most could only imagine. As a ballet dancer, her performances were nothing short of mesmerizing, captivating audiences with every graceful leap and pirouette. Critics hailed her as a rising star, a prodigy destined to redefine the art of ballet. For Ariana, the stage was her sanctuary, a place where she could express her soul without words. But her life wasn't just about the spotlight. Behind the curtains, she had Mike Donovan, her childhood sweetheart and the man she believed would stand by her through anything. They had grown up together in a small town, sharing dreams of escaping to a bigger world. Mike had always been her anchor, the one who whispered words of encouragement before every performance, the one who promised to love her no matter what. Everything seemed perfect. Ariana was preparing for the biggest performance of her career, a lead role in a production that would cement her place among the greats. The world was at her feet, and her future seemed as bright as the stage lights that illuminated her every move. But life has a cruel way of rewriting even the most beautiful stories. On a cold winter evening, just days before her grand performance, Ariana's world came crashing down, literally. Driving home from a late-night rehearsal, her car skidded on an icy road. The impact was devastating. When she woke up in the hospital, the sterile white walls and the beeping of machines were the first things she noticed. The second was the unbearable pain in her back. The doctor's words were like daggers to her heart. A severe spinal injury. She would never dance again. Ariana's dreams shattered in an instant. The stage, the applause, the life she had built, it all felt like a distant memory. But the worst was yet to come. At first, Mike stayed by her side, holding her hand as she struggled to come to terms with her new reality. He told her they would get through it together, that she was still the same Ariana he had always loved. But as the weeks turned into months, his visits grew less frequent. His words of comfort became hollow, and the warmth in his eyes faded. One evening, as Ariana sat in her wheelchair by the window, staring at the snow falling outside, Mike finally said the words she had been dreading. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Ariana, but I need to think about my future too." And just like that, he was gone. Ariana was left alone, her heart broken, her dreams crushed, and her body confined to a chair. The girl who once danced like she was weightless now felt the crushing weight of despair. But life, as cruel as it can be, also has a way of offering second chances. Ariana just didn't know it yet. The days after Mike left were a blur of pain and emptiness for Ariana. She had lost everything that mattered to her, her career, her independence, and now the man she thought would stand by her forever. The once vibrant and confident dancer now spent her days confined to a small apartment, staring at the walls that seemed to close in on her. Her mornings were filled with the monotony of physical therapy sessions that felt more like torture than progress. The doctors had told her there was a slim chance she could regain some mobility with time and effort, but the road ahead was long and uncertain. Ariana wasn't sure she had the strength to keep going. Her nights were even worse. Alone in the dark, she replayed every moment of the accident in her mind, wondering if there was something she could have done differently. The sound of the car skidding, the impact, the shattering glass, it haunted her. And then there was Mike's voice, echoing in her head. "I need to think about my future too." Ariana's only source of support was her Aunt Margaret, a retired nurse who had taken her in after the accident. Margaret was kind and patient, always encouraging Ariana to keep fighting. But even her warmth couldn't fill the void in Ariana's heart. One particularly cold evening, as snow blanketed the city, Ariana sat by the window, watching the world move on without her. She felt like a ghost, invisible and forgotten. The pain in her back was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her soul. "I can't live like this," she whispered to herself, tears streaming down her face. Margaret found her like that, curled up in her wheelchair, sobbing quietly. Without a word, she wrapped a blanket around Ariana's shoulders and sat beside her. "You're stronger than this, Ariana," Margaret said softly. "I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you have a purpose. You just need to find it." Ariana didn't respond. She wanted to believe her aunt's words, but the weight of her despair was too heavy. The turning point came a few weeks later during one of her routine hospital visits. Ariana was waiting for her physical therapist when she overheard a conversation in the hallway. "Dr. Eric Walsh is back in town," one nurse said to another. "I heard he's taking on new patients." Ariana wasn't paying much attention until she heard the next part. "And let me tell you, he definitely works his magic. People who had developed some groundbreaking techniques for spinal injuries, people who were told they'd never walk again, are on their feet because of him." A flicker of hope sparked in Ariana's chest, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had seen countless doctors since the accident, and none of them had been able to offer her more than vague reassurances and painful therapies. Still, the name stuck with her: Dr. Eric Walsh. That evening, as she sat in her room, Ariana decided to look him up. Her laptop was slow, and her hands trembled as she typed, but eventually she found what she was looking for. Eric Walsh was a renowned neurosurgeon specializing in spinal injuries. His work had been featured in medical journals and even on national news. Patients who had been told they would never walk again credited him with giving them their lives back. Ariana stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Could this be her chance? The next morning, she told Margaret about what she had learned. "Do you think he could help me?" Ariana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret hesitated. "It's worth a try," she said finally. "But you need to be prepared, Ariana. This might not be the answer you're looking for." Ariana nodded. She had nothing left to lose. A week later, Ariana found herself sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Walsh's clinic. The walls were painted a soothing shade of blue, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic. She felt out of place, surrounded by people who seemed far more hopeful than she did. When her name was called, Ariana wheeled herself into the office, her heart racing. Dr. Eric Walsh was nothing like she had imagined. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see right through her. His demeanor was calm and professional, but there was an intensity about him that made Ariana feel both nervous and intrigued. "Here, Miss Moore," he said, extending a hand. "I've reviewed your file. You've been through a lot." Ariana shook his hand, her voice catching in her throat. "Do you think you can help me?" Eric studied her for a moment before responding. "I won't lie to you. Your injury is severe and the road to recovery will be long and difficult, but I believe there's a chance we can improve your condition." Ariana's heart leapt. "You mean I could walk again?" "It's possible," Eric said carefully, "but it will require surgery, extensive therapy, and a level of commitment that not everyone is prepared for." "I'll do whatever it takes," Ariana said without hesitation. Eric nodded. "We'll need to run some tests to determine if you're a candidate for the procedure. If everything checks out, we can move forward." For the first time in months, Ariana felt a glimmer of hope. But as she left the clinic that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Eric wasn't telling her. Ariana returned to Dr. Eric Walsh's clinic a week later, her mind racing with a mix of hope and fear. The tests he had ordered were complete, and today she would find out if she was a candidate for the groundbreaking surgery he had mentioned. She had spent the past few days obsessively researching his work, reading testimonials from patients who had gone from wheelchairs to walking within months. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she could dance again. But as she sat in the sterile, quiet office, waiting for Eric to deliver the results, doubt began to creep in. What if the test showed she wasn't a candidate? What if this was just another dead end? The door opened, and Eric walked in, holding a folder. His expression was unreadable, and Ariana's heart sank. "Ms. Moore," he began, sitting across from her, "I've reviewed your test results, and I believe you're a good candidate for the procedure." Ariana's breath caught. "You mean you can help me?" Eric nodded. "Yes. The surgery is complex, and the recovery process will be grueling, but I believe we can significantly improve your mobility. With time and effort, there's a strong possibility you'll be able to walk again." Tears welled up in Ariana's eyes. She had spent months hearing nothing but bad news, and now, finally, there was a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Eric held up a hand. "Before we move forward, there's something we need to discuss." Ariana's stomach tightened. She had been waiting for the catch, the part where this all became too good to be true. "The procedure and the subsequent therapy are expensive," Eric said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Even with insurance, the costs can be overwhelming. I've seen too many patients give up halfway through because they couldn't afford to continue." Ariana's heart sank. She had no savings, no income, and no way to pay for something like this. "I don't have that kind of money," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I thought you might say that. That's why I'm prepared to offer you an alternative." Ariana frowned. "What kind of alternative?" Eric hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I'm in a complicated situation," he began. "I have a young daughter, Elizabeth, who means the world to me. But due to certain legal and personal circumstances, I need to present a stable family environment to retain custody of her." Ariana blinked, unsure of where this was going. "I need someone to act as my wife," Eric continued. "It would be a temporary arrangement, 6 months, no more. In exchange, I'll cover all the costs of your surgery and therapy." The room fell silent as Ariana processed his words. She had expected a financial hurdle, maybe even a loan she couldn't repay, but this was something else entirely. "You want me to marry you?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "On paper, yes," Eric said. "It would be a legal arrangement, nothing more. You'd live in my home, attend a few events with me, and help create the appearance of a stable family. In return, I'll make sure you get the treatment you need." Ariana stared at him, her mind racing. The offer was outrageous, almost absurd, but at the same time, it was her only chance. Without this surgery, she would never walk again, let alone dance. "Woo me?" she asked finally. "You don't even know me." Eric's expression softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Because I believe you deserve a second chance," he said simply. "And because I think you're strong enough to handle this." Ariana looked down at her hands, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. The idea of marrying a stranger, even temporarily, was terrifying, but the thought of spending the rest of her life in a wheelchair was even worse. "What happens after 6 months?" she asked. "We go our separate ways," Eric said. "No strings attached. You'll have your mobility back, and I'll have resolved my situation." Ariana took a deep breath. This was insane, completely, utterly insane. But what choice did she have? "Okay," she said finally. "I'll do it." Eric nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork. We'll schedule the surgery as soon as everything is finalized." As Ariana left the clinic that day, she felt a strange mix of hope and dread. She was about to embark on a journey that could change her life forever. But at what cost? The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Ariana signed the marriage contract, moved into Eric's sprawling home, and prepared for the surgery that would determine her future. The house was beautiful but cold, filled with sleek furniture and muted colors that reflected Eric's no-nonsense personality. Elizabeth, Eric's 7-year-old daughter, was shy and reserved, watching Ariana with wide, curious eyes but saying little. It was clear she wasn't sure what to make of this new stepmother who had suddenly appeared in her life. Eric, for his part, was polite but distant. He treated Ariana more like a business partner than a wife, sticking to the terms of their agreement with almost clinical precision. But despite the awkwardness of their arrangement, Ariana couldn't help but feel a growing sense of gratitude. For the first time in months, she had a purpose, a goal to work toward. The surgery was scheduled, and she was determined to make the most of this second chance. Still, there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, a sense that Eric was hiding something. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than he was letting on. And as she prepared for the surgery that could change her life, Ariana couldn't help but wonder, what had she gotten herself into? The morning of Ariana's surgery arrived faster than she had expected. As she lay on the hospital bed, staring at the bright overhead lights, a wave of anxiety washed over her. This was it, the moment that could change everything. If the surgery was successful, she might walk again. If it wasn't, she didn't want to think about that. Eric stood at the foot of her bed, his expression calm and composed as always. He had been there every step of the way, ensuring that the best surgeons and specialists were on her case. But even now, as he reassured her that everything would be fine, Ariana couldn't help but feel the distance between them. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice steady. Ariana nodded, though her hands trembled. "I think so." Eric hesitated for a moment, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Ariana. You've got this." His words, though simple, gave her a small sense of comfort. She closed her eyes as the anesthesiologist began the countdown, and within moments, the world faded to black. The surgery was a success. When Ariana woke up, groggy and disoriented, the first thing she saw was Eric sitting in a chair by her bedside, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the hospital room's lights. He looked tired, as if he hadn't slept in days, but there was a hint of relief in his eyes. "It went well," he said, his voice low but steady. "The doctors are optimistic." Ariana felt a surge of emotion, relief, gratitude, and a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in months. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Eric nodded, but his expression remained guarded. "The hard part starts now. Recovery won't be easy, but if you're willing to put in the work, I believe you can do this." Ariana knew he was right. The surgery was just the beginning. The weeks that followed were some of the most challenging of Ariana's life. Physical therapy was grueling, pushing her to her limits, both physically and emotionally. There were days when the pain was so intense that she wanted to give up. But every time she felt like quitting, she thought about the stage, the applause, and the dream she had fought so hard to hold on to. Eric was a constant presence, though he kept his distance. He drove her to therapy sessions, checked in with her doctors, and made sure she had everything she needed, but their interactions were always formal, almost businesslike. At home, their arrangement was equally awkward. Ariana had moved into Eric's spacious modern house, which felt more like a museum than a home. The walls were adorned with abstract art, the furniture was sleek and minimalist, and everything was impeccably clean. It was a far cry from the cozy, cluttered apartment she had shared with her aunt. Elizabeth, Eric's 7-year-old daughter, was another challenge. The little girl was shy and reserved, often retreating to her room when Ariana was around. It was clear that she didn't know what to make of this new stepmother who had suddenly appeared in her life. One evening, as Ariana sat in the living room, struggling to stretch her legs after a particularly painful therapy session, Elizabeth wandered in, clutching a stuffed rabbit. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Ariana with wide, curious eyes. "Hi," Ariana said softly, offering a small smile. Elizabeth hesitated, then took a tentative step forward. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ariana nodded. "Sometimes, but it's getting better." Elizabeth seemed to consider this, then held out her stuffed rabbit. "You can borrow Mr. Floppy if you want. He helps me feel better when I'm sad." Ariana's heart melted. She reached out and gently took the rabbit. "Thank you, Elizabeth. That's very kind of you." From that moment on, the ice between them began to thaw. Elizabeth started spending more time with Ariana, asking questions about her therapy and even helping her with small tasks around the house. Eric noticed the change, but said little. He seemed content to let Ariana and Elizabeth form their own bond, though there were moments when Ariana caught him watching them with a strange expression, something between gratitude and sadness. As the weeks turned into months, Ariana began to see progress. She could stand for short periods with the help of a walker, and her therapists were optimistic about her long-term recovery. But while her physical condition was improving, her relationship with Eric remained as complicated as ever. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dining table, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. Ariana decided to break it. "Why did you really ask me to do this?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Eric looked up from his plate, his gray eyes meeting hers. "I told you. I needed someone to help me create a stable environment for Elizabeth." Ariana shook her head. "That's not the whole story, is it? There's something you're not telling me." Eric sighed, running a hand through his hair. For a moment, he looked almost vulnerable, a stark contrast to the composed, confident man she had come to know. "My ex-wife, Vanessa, has been trying to take Elizabeth away from me," he admitted. "She claims I'm too focused on my work to be a good father. The court has been less than sympathetic." Ariana frowned. "But you're a great father. Anyone can see that." Eric's lips curved into a bitter smile. "The court doesn't care about that. They care about appearances. A single father with a demanding career doesn't exactly scream stability." Ariana felt a pang of sympathy. She had seen the way Eric doted on Elizabeth, the way he always made time for her despite his busy schedule. It was clear that he loved his daughter more than anything. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Eric shrugged, his expression hardening once again. "It is what it is. That's why I needed you, to show the court that Elizabeth has a stable, loving home." Ariana nodded, though a part of her couldn't help but feel like there was more to the story. As the 6-month mark of their arrangement approached, Ariana found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. She was grateful to Eric for giving her a second chance at life, but she couldn't ignore the growing connection she felt toward him and Elizabeth. And though Eric remained distant, there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when she thought she saw something more in his eyes. But just as Ariana began to hope that their arrangement might become something real, a shadow from Eric's past threatened to unravel everything. Ariana's life had settled into a strange rhythm. Mornings were spent in grueling physical therapy sessions, afternoons were dedicated to stretching and strengthening exercises at home, and evenings were a quiet mix of awkward dinners with Eric and moments of bonding with Elizabeth. The house, which had once felt cold and unwelcoming, was beginning to feel a little more like home. Ariana had even started adding small touches to make it cozier. A vase of fresh flowers on the dining table, a soft throw blanket draped over the couch. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel like she belonged, at least for now. Elizabeth had warmed up to her considerably. The little girl often followed Ariana around the house, asking endless questions about ballet and watching in awe as Ariana demonstrated simple arm movements or told stories about her performances. "Do you think you'll ever dance again?" Elizabeth asked one evening as they sat on the living room floor, coloring together. Ariana hesitated, her heart aching at the question. "I hope so," she said finally. But even if I can't, I'll find another way to share my love for dance." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe you could teach me," she said, her eyes lighting up. Ariana smiled, her chest tightening with emotion. "I'd like that," she said softly. While her bond with Elizabeth grew stronger, her relationship with Eric remained complicated. He was always polite, always supportive, but there was a wall between them that Ariana couldn't seem to break through. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dining table, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. Ariana decided to address the elephant in the room. "Rikveta," she began, her voice hesitant. "Do you ever think about what happens after this is over?" Eric looked up from his plate, his gray eyes meeting hers. "What do you mean?" This arrangement," Ariana said, gesturing vaguely. "The contract, the 6 months. What happens when it's done?" Eric's expression was unreadable. "We go back to our lives," he said simply. Ariana felt a pang of disappointment, though she wasn't sure why. "And Elizabeth?" she asked. "What do you plan to tell her?" Eric hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I'll figure it out," he said finally. Ariana frowned. "She's a smart kid, Eric. She's going to know something's not right." Eric sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he admitted. "But I'm doing the best I can. This isn't exactly a situation I ever planned for." Ariana wanted to press him further, to ask why he always seemed so guarded, but she held back. She had learned by now that Eric wasn't the type to open up easily. Despite the tension between them, there were moments when Ariana caught glimpses of a different side of Eric. One evening, as she struggled to reach a book on a high shelf in the living room, Eric appeared out of nowhere, effortlessly grabbing it for her. "Thanks," she said, slightly startled. Eric handed her the book, his lips curving into a faint smile. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Ariana raised an eyebrow. "And you're just figuring that out now?" For a moment they both laughed, the sound breaking through the usual tension between them. It was a small moment, but it stayed with Ariana long after Eric had left the room. As the weeks passed, Ariana began to notice other small changes. Eric, who had always been so distant, started spending more time at home. He joined her and Elizabeth for dinner more often, and sometimes she even caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. One evening, as they sat on the back patio watching the sunset, Eric surprised her by asking about her life before the accident. "What was it like?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Being on stage." Ariana hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "It was magical," she said finally. "There's nothing else like it. The lights, the music, the feeling of losing yourself in the movement. It's like you're part of something bigger than yourself." Eric nodded, his gaze distant. "I can see why you'd fight so hard to get it back." Ariana looked at him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "What about you?" she asked. "Why did you become a doctor?" Eric hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Because I wanted to help people," he said simply. Ariana sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't push. She had learned by now that Eric only shared what he was ready to share. Their fragile peace was disrupted one afternoon when Vanessa, Eric's ex-wife, showed up unannounced. Ariana was in the kitchen, helping Elizabeth with her homework, when the doorbell rang. Eric answered it, and the moment Vanessa stepped inside, the tension in the air was palpable. She was tall and striking, with sharp features and an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Eric," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "we need to talk." Ariana stayed in the kitchen, trying to keep Elizabeth distracted, but she couldn't help overhearing snippets of their conversation. "You think this little charade is going to fool anyone?" Vanessa said, her voice cold. "You can't just bring some random woman into Elizabeth's life and expect the court to buy it." "This isn't about you, Vanessa," Eric replied, his tone calm but firm. "It's about what's best for Elizabeth." Vanessa laughed. the sound bitter. "And you think this arrangement is what's best for her? You're delusional." Ariana's stomach twisted. She had known from the beginning that their marriage was a facade, but hearing it laid out so bluntly was still painful. When Vanessa finally left, slamming the door behind her, Eric walked into the kitchen, his expression stormy. "I'm sorry about that," he said, his voice tight. Ariana shook her head. "It's fine," she said, though her chest ached with a mix of anger and sadness. Eric looked at her for a long moment, as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he just nodded and walked away. That night, as Ariana lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about Vanessa's words. She had agreed to this arrangement because it was her only chance to walk again, but now she couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake. And yet, despite everything, she couldn't deny the growing connection she felt toward Eric and Elizabeth. They had become her family, even if it was only temporary. But as the 6-month mark of their agreement loomed closer, Ariana knew she had to face the truth. She was falling for Eric. And she had no idea what to do about it. The days following Vanessa's visit were tense. Eric became more withdrawn, spending long hours in his office or at the hospital, and Ariana couldn't shake the feeling that he was avoiding her. Elizabeth, sensing the tension, clung to Ariana more than ever, seeking comfort in their growing bond. Ariana tried to focus on her recovery, throwing herself into her physical therapy with renewed determination. She was making progress, slow but steady, and her therapists were optimistic that she would soon be able to walk without assistance. But even as she celebrated these small victories, a part of her couldn't ignore the growing ache in her chest. She was falling for Eric. It was a realization that terrified her. Their marriage was a lie, a temporary arrangement born out of necessity, and yet she couldn't help but feel drawn to him. She saw glimpses of the man behind the stoic facade, the way he doted on Elizabeth, the rare moments of vulnerability he allowed himself to show, the quiet strength that had carried him through so much. But she also knew that Eric was holding something back. There was a part of him that he kept locked away, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't reach it. One evening, as Ariana sat in the living room, stretching her legs after a long day of therapy, Eric walked in. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, and his tie loosened, but there was something else in his expression, something she couldn't quite place. "E?" she said softly, offering him a small smile. "Hey," he replied, sitting down on the couch across from her. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the heater. "I wanted to thank you," Ariana said finally, breaking the silence. Eric frowned. "For what?" "For everything," she said, her voice steady. "For giving me a second chance. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Eric's expression softened, and for a moment, she thought he might say something, but then he looked away. "You don't owe me anything, Ariana," he said quietly. Ariana hesitated, then decided to take a chance. "Why do you do that?" she asked. "Do what?" "Push people away," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You act like you don't care, but I know you do. I see it in the way you are with Elizabeth, the way you've been there for me. So why do you keep everyone at arm's length?" Eric's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might shut her out again, but then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's easier that way," he admitted. "When you let people in, you give them the power to hurt you, and I've been hurt enough for one lifetime." Ariana's heart ached at his words. "Eric," she began, but he shook his head. "You don't need to worry about me," he said, his voice firm. "Focus on your recovery. That's what matters." Ariana wanted to argue, to tell him that he mattered too, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Eric had built walls around himself, and she wasn't sure she could break them down. The turning point came a few days later, when Vanessa returned. This time, she didn't bother with pleasantries. She stormed into the house, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, and demanded to speak with Eric. Ariana was in the kitchen with Elizabeth when she heard the commotion. She tried to keep the little girl distracted, but it was impossible to ignore Vanessa's raised voice. "This charade isn't going to work, Eric," Vanessa said, her tone icy. "The court isn't stupid. They'll see right through it." "I'm doing what's best for Elizabeth," Eric replied, his voice calm but firm. Vanessa laughed, the sound bitter. "You think dragging some random woman into her life is what's best for her? You're delusional." Ariana's hands clenched into fists. She had tried to stay out of it, but hearing Vanessa talk about her like she was nothing more than a pawn in Eric's plan was too much. She walked into the living room, her heart pounding. "I'm not just some random woman," she said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Vanessa turned to her, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, please," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "You're nothing more than a placeholder. Do you really think this little act is going to fool anyone?" Ariana took a deep breath, refusing to let Vanessa's words get to her. "I don't care what you think," she said. "What matters is Elizabeth. She's happy here and she's thriving. That's what's best for her." Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but Eric stepped between them, his expression hard. "That's enough, Vanessa," he said, his voice cold. "You've said your piece. Now leave." Vanessa glared at him, but after a moment she turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. "Are you okay?" Eric asked, turning to Ariana. She nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "I'm fine," she said. "But Eric, this isn't just about Elizabeth, is it?" Eric hesitated, his jaw tightening. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there's more to this than you're letting on," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Why is Vanessa so determined to take Elizabeth away from you?" Eric sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because she doesn't think I'm good enough," he admitted. "She thinks my work makes me a bad father, that I can't give Elizabeth the attention she needs." Ariana frowned. "That's not true," she said. "You're an amazing father. Anyone can see that." Eric's lips curved into a bitter smile. "The court doesn't care about that," he said. "They care about appearances, and that's why I needed you." Ariana's heart ached at his words. She had known from the beginning that their marriage was a facade, but hearing it laid out so bluntly still hurt. But even as she grappled with her emotions, she couldn't ignore the growing realization that she wanted more than just an arrangement. She wanted a real marriage, a real family. And she wasn't sure if Eric felt the same. The days after Vanessa's visit were filled with an uneasy silence. Eric became more distant than ever, retreating into his work and avoiding any meaningful conversations with Ariana. She tried to focus on her recovery, but the tension in the house was impossible to ignore. Elizabeth, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, clung to Ariana even more. The little girl had become a source of light in Ariana's life, and their bond only deepened as they spent more time together. But even Elizabeth's laughter couldn't fully distract Ariana from the growing ache in her chest. She was in love with Eric. It was a truth she could no longer deny, no matter how much she tried to push it aside. She had fallen for the man behind the stoic facade, the father who would do anything for his daughter, the person who had given her a second chance at life. But Eric's walls were as strong as ever, and Ariana didn't know if she would ever be able to break through them. One evening, as Ariana sat in the living room, stretching her legs after a long day of therapy, Eric walked in. He looked tired, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. But there was something different about him, something softer. "Hey," she said softly, offering him a small smile. "Hey," he replied, sitting down on the couch across from her. For a moment they sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the heater. "I wanted to apologize," Eric said finally, his voice quiet. Ariana frowned, surprised. "For what?" "For everything," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "For dragging you into this mess, for putting you in the middle of my problems with Vanessa. You didn't deserve any of it. Ariana shook her head. Eric, you didn't drag me into anything. I agreed to this because I wanted to, and honestly, I don't regret it. Eric looked up at her, his gray eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. You don't? No, she said firmly, because this isn't just about you, or Vanessa, or even Elizabeth. This is about me, too. You gave me a chance to get my life back, and I'll always be grateful for that. Eric's expression softened, and for a moment she thought he might say something more, but then he looked away. You're stronger than you think, Ariana, he said quietly. Ariana's heart ached at his words. She wanted to tell him how she felt, to confess the feelings she had been holding back for so long, but she was afraid that he didn't feel the same, afraid that she would ruin everything. So instead, she said nothing. The turning point came a few days later, when Ariana received an unexpected visitor. She was in the kitchen, helping Elizabeth with her homework, when the doorbell rang. I'll get it, she said, ruffling Elizabeth's hair before heading to the door. When she opened it, she was shocked to see Julian standing on the porch. Ariana, he said, his voice filled with a mix of regret and desperation. Can we talk? Ariana's stomach twisted. She hadn't seen Julian since the accident, since the day he had walked out of her life when she needed him most. Seeing him now, after everything she had been through, felt like a punch to the gut. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice cold. I heard about your surgery, Julian said, his eyes pleading. I wanted to see you, to apologize. Ariana crossed her arms, her heart pounding. You want to apologize? After all this time? Julian nodded. I made a mistake, Ariana. I was scared, and I didn't know how to handle everything, but I've never stopped thinking about you. Ariana stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and confusion. You left me, Julian, she said, her voice trembling. When I needed you the most, you walked away. I know, Julian said, his voice filled with regret, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I want to make it right. I want to be there for you now. Ariana shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. It's too late, Julian. I've moved on. Julian's face fell, but before he could say anything else, Eric appeared in the doorway. Is everything okay? Eric asked, his voice calm but firm. Ariana turned to him, her heart racing. It's fine, she said quickly. Julian glanced at Eric, his expression hardening. Who's this? I'm her husband, Eric said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Julian's eyes widened in shock. You're married? Yes, Ariana said, her voice steady. And I'm happy, so please, just leave. Julian hesitated, his gaze flickering between Ariana and Eric, but eventually he nodded. I'm sorry, he said quietly, before turning and walking away. As the door closed behind him, Ariana let out a shaky breath. Are you okay? Eric asked, his voice filled with concern. Ariana nodded, though her hands were still trembling. I'm fine, she said. Thank you. Eric studied her for a moment, then reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to face this alone, Ariana, he said softly. Ariana looked up at him, her heart aching at the kindness in his eyes. I know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, as Ariana lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Julian's visit had stirred up old wounds, but it had also made her realize something important. She didn't need him anymore. She had found something better, something real. And as she thought about Eric, about the way he had stood by her through everything, she knew she couldn't keep her feelings to herself any longer. It was time to tell him the truth. Ariana spent the next few days rehearsing what she wanted to say to Eric. Every time she thought about confessing her feelings, her heart raced, and doubt crept in. What if he didn't feel the same? What if she ruined everything? but deep down she knew she couldn't keep her emotions bottled up any longer. Eric had given her so much, his support, his kindness, and a chance to rebuild her life. And while their marriage had started as nothing more than an arrangement, it had become something real for her. She needed to know if it had become real for him, too. One evening, after Elizabeth had gone to bed, Ariana found Eric in his office. He was sitting at his desk, his laptop open in front of him, but his attention seemed elsewhere. His shoulders were tense, and there was a distant look in his eyes. "Eric," she said softly, stepping into the room. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Ariana, is everything okay?" She nodded, though her heart was pounding. "Can we talk?" Eric hesitated, then closed his laptop and gestured for her to sit. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Ariana took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Eric frowned slightly, his expression unreadable. "What about us?" "I know this started as an arrangement," she said, choosing her words carefully. "And I know we both agreed that it was temporary. But over the past few months, things have changed for me." Eric's jaw tightened, and she could see the tension in his posture. "Ariana, please, let me finish," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I didn't expect this to happen, but I've fallen for you, Eric. I've fallen for you and Elizabeth, and I don't want this to end. I want us to be a real family." For a moment the room was silent. Eric stared at her, his gray eyes filled with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite decipher. "Ariana," he said finally, his voice low. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I know how I feel, Eric, and I think you feel it too, even if you're too scared to admit it." Eric stood, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't about feelings," he said, his tone sharp. "This is about what's best for Elizabeth. That's all this has ever been about." Ariana's heart sank at his words, but she refused to back down. "You're lying," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You care about me, Eric. I've seen it in the way you look at me, the way you've been there for me. You can't tell me that none of this is real for you." Eric turned away, his shoulders tense. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It matters to me," Ariana said, tears stinging her eyes. "I love you, Eric, and I think you love me too, but you're too afraid to let yourself feel it." Eric didn't respond, and the silence that followed was deafening. Finally, he turned back to her, his expression pained. "You deserve someone who can give you everything, Ariana," he said, his voice filled with regret. "And I'm not that person. I can't be." Ariana felt her heart shatter at his words. She had taken a leap of faith, and it had left her broken. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, tears streaming down her face. The days that followed were some of the hardest Ariana had ever faced. She threw herself into her recovery, using the pain in her heart as fuel to push herself harder. Her therapists were amazed at her progress, and for the first time since the accident, she was able to take a few steps without assistance. But even as she celebrated these milestones, the ache in her chest remained. She had opened her heart to Eric, and he had pushed her away. Elizabeth, sensing that something was wrong, tried to cheer her up in her own way. The little girl's laughter and hugs were a balm for Ariana's wounded heart, but they couldn't erase the pain completely. Eric, meanwhile, seemed more distant than ever. He avoided her whenever possible, and when they did speak, his words were clipped and formal. It was as if he was trying to put as much distance between them as he could. The final blow came when Vanessa returned, this time with a lawyer in tow. She was determined to take Elizabeth away, and she wasn't going to back down without a fight. Eric was furious, but Ariana could see the fear in his eyes. He loved Elizabeth more than anything, and the thought of losing her was tearing him apart. Ariana knew she couldn't stand by and do nothing. She had promised herself that she would fight for the people she loved, and that included Eric and Elizabeth. So, she made a decision. One evening, as Eric sat in the living room, staring blankly at the fireplace, Ariana approached him. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady. Eric looked up at her, his expression weary. "Ariana, I don't think—" "No," she said firmly, cutting him off. "You're going to listen to me this time." Eric sighed but nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "I know you're scared," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "I know you've been hurt before, and I know you think pushing people away is the only way to protect yourself. But you don't have to do this alone, Eric. You don't have to fight Vanessa alone." Eric frowned, his jaw tightening. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm not going anywhere," she said, her eyes locking with his. "I love you, Eric, and I love Elizabeth, and I'm going to fight for this family, whether you want me to or not." Eric stared at her, his gray eyes filled with a mix of emotions, fear, hope, and something else she couldn't quite place. "Ariana," he began, but she shook her head. "No more excuses," she said. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just know that I'm here, and I'm not giving up on you." For a moment, Eric said nothing. Then, to her surprise, he reached out and took her hand. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. Ariana smiled, her heart swelling with hope. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The days leading up to the custody hearing were a whirlwind of preparation and tension. Vanessa was relentless, determined to prove that Eric was an unfit father. Her lawyer had built a case around Eric's long work hours and the unconventional nature of his marriage to Ariana. Ariana could see the toll it was taking on Eric. He barely slept, spending his nights poring over legal documents and strategizing with his lawyer. Elizabeth, too young to understand the full extent of what was happening, clung to Ariana for comfort. But Ariana refused to let Vanessa win. She had made a promise to herself and to Eric that she would fight for their family, and she intended to keep it. The day of the hearing arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Vanessa sat at one table, her lawyer by her side, exuding confidence. Eric and Ariana sat at the other, their lawyer speaking in hushed tones as they waited for the judge to arrive. Ariana's heart pounded as the proceedings began. Vanessa's lawyer wasted no time painting Eric as a workaholic who had no time for his daughter. He questioned the legitimacy of Eric and Ariana's marriage, implying that it was nothing more than a ploy to gain favor with the court. Ariana's hands clenched into fists as she listened, anger simmering beneath the surface. She wanted to stand up and defend Eric, to tell the court about the man she had come to know and love. But she knew she had to wait for her turn. When Eric's lawyer finally called her to the stand, Ariana took a deep breath and walked to the front of the courtroom. She could feel Eric's eyes on her, and the weight of his trust gave her the strength she needed. "Mrs. Carter," the lawyer began, addressing her by the name she had taken when she and Eric married. "Can you tell the court about your relationship with Mr. Carter and his role as a father to Elizabeth?" Ariana nodded, her voice steady as she spoke. "Eric is one of the most dedicated and loving fathers I've ever met," she said. "He works hard to provide for Elizabeth, but he always makes time for her. He's the kind of father who will drop everything to be there when she needs him." The lawyer nodded. "And what about your marriage? How would you describe your relationship with Mr. Carter?" Ariana hesitated for a moment, then decided to speak from the heart. "When we first got married, it was unconventional," she admitted. "But over time, I've come to see the kind of man Eric is. He's kind, selfless, and he puts his daughter above everything else. I love him, and I love Elizabeth. They've become my family." Vanessa's lawyer stood, his expression smug. "Mrs. Carter, isn't it true that your marriage to Mr. Carter was arranged as part of a deal to help you recover from your accident?" Ariana's heart sank, but she refused to let the question shake her. "Yes," she said honestly. "But that doesn't change how I feel now. What started as an arrangement has become something real. I love Eric, and I love Elizabeth, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect them." The lawyer smirked, as if he thought he had won, but Ariana didn't care. She had spoken her truth, and that was all that mattered. The hearing dragged on for hours, each side presenting their arguments and evidence. By the time the judge called for a recess, Ariana felt emotionally drained. She and Eric sat together in the hallway outside the courtroom, the weight of the day pressing down on them. "Thank you," Eric said quietly, breaking the silence. Ariana turned to him, surprised. "For what?" "For standing up for me," he said, his gray eyes filled with gratitude. "For standing up for us." Ariana smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "I meant every word," she said softly. Eric hesitated, then reached out and took her hand. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice filled with regret. "Yes, you do," Ariana said firmly. "You just have to let yourself believe it." For a moment they sat in silence, their hands intertwined. It wasn't a grand declaration of love, but it was a step forward, and that was enough for Ariana. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Ariana held her breath as the judge spoke, her heart pounding in her chest. Her reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony from both parties, it is clear to this court that Mr. Carter has provided a stable and loving environment for his daughter, the judge said. While the unconventional nature of his marriage to Mrs. Carter was noted, it is evident that their relationship is genuine and that they both have Elizabeth's best interests at heart. Therefore, custody will remain with Mr. Carter. Relief washed over Ariana as the judge's words sank in. She turned to Eric, who looked as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. Ariana smiled, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she said softly,